So as Sam mentioned, I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. I work for the Water and Climate team. The team primarily focuses on developing federal and state policy solutions centered around climate and disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. In particular, we advocate for climate-smart reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program. We do this because the National Flood Insurance Program, for better or worse, is central to the nation's ability to address the damage wreaked to people's homes by floods as exacerbated by climate change. So the type of work that we look at doing is we advocate for better buyout policies, we advocate for maps that are forward-looking, and we advocate for what will be the topic of this presentation, improving homeowners, buyers, and renters' right to access information about their flood risk and past flood damages, and how those can be achieved through reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program. So across America, millions of families live in homes that are susceptible to flooding. 41 million people, by some estimates, are expected to be exposed to the 1% annual chance flood, or a 1 in 100-year flood, which is about 3 times what FEMA approximates. But one only really needs to kind of look at this image. This is from NOAA, and this is the flood projections for this spring. As you can see, 2/3 of the United States are at risk for flooding, and about 25 states are at risk for moderate to major flooding going through the end of May. And unfortunately, flood risks are not improving. As seas continue to rise and extreme precipitation events become more common, the nation's flood vulnerability is likely to worsen. Rising sea level has already increased the number of tidal floods that occur each year by 5 to 10-fold since the 1960s in several East Coast cities. And as you can see from this graph, 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise is going to have drastic impacts for East Coast populations. It's projected that 3 feet of sea level rise could inundate the homes of 4.2 million Americans, and 6 feet of sea level rise could inundate the homes of 13.1 million Americans. And long before those homes are permanently lost, they are likely to become repeatedly flooded. And unfortunately, it doesn't get much better if you live in the inland United States. Riverine environments are also experiencing increased flood risk. The National Climate Association assessment, or the National Climate Assessment, asserts that the heaviest rainfalls are becoming heavier and more frequent. And per a recent study that was conducted by AECOM, the average in riverine floodplain is expected to increase by 45%. So why am I throwing all these statistics at you? It's really to underscore that millions of more Americans are going to be at risk of flooding by the end of the century, and thus ensuring they are adequately prepared and, more importantly, informed about their flood risks is going to be paramount for disaster and emergency work. However, for homeowners, home buyers, and renters to even learn about current flood risks, let alone future flood risks, is problematic. The inadequacy of flood risk disclosure laws and lack of access to FEMA data on flooding makes them and their properties vulnerable. So I'd like to show you a map of existing flood risk disclosure laws. As you can see, 31 states have either inadequate or no disclosure laws specific to flooding. Roughly 2/3 of the United States lack adequate disclosure laws. And inadequate disclosure laws means that far too many American families have little knowledge of whether the biggest financial investment of their lives has ever flooded or is likely to flood again in the future. So this map is based on research that I did for NRDC last year. And we rank states based on from best to worst, or best to none, on their quality of flood risk disclosure laws. States that have a red, none, obviously have no disclosure laws in regard to specific statutes or regulations requiring disclosure of past flood damages, whether a property is in a floodplain, and whether insurance is required on the property. Inadequate means that maybe they require disclosure if a property is in a floodplain, but not much else. Adequate gets a little bit better. Maybe they require disclosure of past flood damages and whether a property is in a floodplain, but not whether insurance is required. And then better, they require all three, with best being those states go above and beyond. So let me give you some examples. Missouri is a highly flood-prone state, as most of you probably know. The state right now, since 1978, has had $820 million in NFIP damages on 41,000 claims. And this is despite an extensive system of levees that are meant to kind of prevent flooding from happening. Yet Missouri homebuyers are kept in the dark about those flood risks. Missouri has no statutory or regulatory requirements for a seller to disclose a property's flood risks or past flood damages to a potential buyer. In fact, when I was doing research on Missouri, the only disclosure law that I could find on the books was one about whether the house was a meth lab. So you got to disclose if the house is a meth lab, but not whether or not it's ever flooded before. I think the flooding issue is probably a lot more serious in the case of Missouri. And let's go to another state. So Florida. No flood risk there, right? No. Florida has no statutory or regulatory requirements for a seller to disclose a property's flood risks or past flood damages to a buyer. However, Florida's flood risk is high. Florida has had since 1978 50 presidentially declared disasters related to flooding, and has had almost $5.3 billion in Nfip claims on about 185,000 claims. Yet, as a buyer, you, under the statutes and regulations in Florida, would have not much of a right to learn that information from the seller. Some states are doing better. So Ohio, where we are today, graded a C. That's because Ohio requires disclosure of past flood damages as well as whether a property is located in a floodplain. However, Ohio still only got a C because they don't require disclosure of whether or not a property is required to be insured, have flood insurance. And you might say, well, wait, I thought that if they were going through the buying process, the lender would tell them that they were required to have flood insurance as part of the requirement to have a mortgage. And while that's true, it doesn't necessarily tell the whole flood picture. So let's say you have a property that was flooded during a major disaster and a presidentially declared disaster was issued. The property owner received aid to rebuild. Well, under that circumstance, that property forever is required to carry flood insurance. So every single future owner of that property must maintain flood insurance. That should be disclosed during the real estate transaction process because of the impacts that it can have. For example, if you live in that property, you get flooded and you didn't know that you needed flood insurance, you could be ineligible for disaster aid. So making sure that information is out there is really important. And it's not to say that this is overly burdensome. There are states that are very good actors. So states like Louisiana, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Mississippi all graded A because they have very good flood risk disclosure laws. As you can see from here, Louisiana requires a seller to divulge whether any flooding has ever occurred on the property, and if so, the nature and frequency of that flooding defect. Is the property in a flood zone? If yes, what's the flood zone classification and the source and date of that information? How about the structures on the property? Have they ever taken on water due to a flood? And if so, what's the nature and frequency of that defect? Is there flood insurance required? Is there flood insurance on the property? And importantly, is the seller or previous owner a recipient of federal disaster aid that would require an owner to obtain and maintain flood insurance on that property? So it's not unreasonable to say that these are important things to require, as some states have already done them. However, the states that have required these provisions are few and far between. The majority of states have a hodgepodge of disclosure laws that actually really hinder buyers from making fully informed decisions about how they can best avoid or mitigate their flood risks while going into probably what, as mentioned before, is to be one of the biggest financial investments of their life. A simple solution would be to specifically require sellers to disclose flood risks to home buyers, ensuring buyers have a right to know whether a home has ever flooded, and if so, how many times and at what cost, if a home is located within a designated floodplain, and if insurance is required. If a seller has access and knowledge of this information, they should be required to provide it. To advocate otherwise is to really advocate for a perverse game of what I call a perverse game of musical chairs. We're basically perpetuating a situation where the buyers keep on turning over, and eventually the last person who's left loses everything because they were not adequately informed of the risks that they were facing. However, I'm not saying that flood risk disclosure laws are a panacea. They're just one part of the flood story for a given property in terms of the information that should be provided. So FEMA must also improve the flood risk information that is available to the public. Through the Nfip, they collect a massive amount of data on claims, policy histories, whether a property is a severe or repetitive loss property, information on when it was built and if it was built before the actual date of the flood insurance rate map, which will give you an indication on if it's even built to appropriate levels for flood risk. But that information is very hard to come by. So this morning I went onto FEMA's website and I went to the Nfip statistics page. If you click on the link that says claims, all you get is a PDF that lists the state and the amount of claims as well as the total dollar amounts. You used to be able to look at each county and then each town within the county that was participating in the Nfip. You can no longer do that. That is a huge problem. That is very little information for a buyer or even for the general public to learn about the flood risks. So what can we do about that? Well, changes can start with advocating for reform of the Nfip. One, making sure that homeowners have a right to know their flood risk information. Right now, let's say you're a homeowner and you live in a state with poor disclosure laws. You might have never been told what your home's flood risk was going to be during that period. However, if the home was ever flooded and insured by FEMA, FEMA would know that information. So why not give current homeowners a right to know that information? They should be able to find out from FEMA, what's the insurance cover requirements on the property, what are past damage assessments, and how about payment of claims. And FEMA should be able to provide information to the broader public, especially emergency management and disaster professionals. I mean, to get information on a zip code or census tract level on current and historical flood policy information, current and historical claims information, repeat and severe repetitive loss properties. Like I said before, whether a property was ever built before the actual date of the flood insurance rate map, and community compliance status is all really important for giving a complete picture of a region or a property's flood history. And right now, it's incredibly difficult to do that. I mean, I could go out in the parking lot today, pull off a VIN number from a car, and look up that car's history. But I can't really do that for a home, especially in regard to flood risk. And that's highly problematic because it puts people in danger. If they don't have access to good information, they are unable to make informed decisions about how to best either mitigate their flood risks or to avoid it in the first place. And that's why we are really emphasizing the importance of disclosure and transparency. A property that has flooded once is likely to flood again. More than 100,000 properties have been insured through the Nfip have flooded at least twice. And that's just counting back to the early 70s. Homeowners, home buyers are able to learn whether a property has flooded in the past and is at risk of flooding again, and they should be able to learn that through a complete picture. One, by having good disclosure laws, and two, by having access to information by FEMA. The two need to work together as a whole. Because let's say you live in outside the 100-year floodplain. Well, chances of getting information from FEMA could be rather limited, even though 25% of all claims occur outside the 100-year floodplain. So that's where a good disclosure law comes into place. But if you have a great disclosure law and the seller doesn't actually have knowledge of the flood risk due to the flood never happening while they're there, that's where then information from FEMA can come into play. And so you really need both parts working in unison to give a complete flood picture of an area or a home. And it shouldn't be public policy to keep people in the dark about the potential for devastating events like flooding. And I'm not saying that flood disclosures is a panacea, but like a good insurance policy, easy access to information is not going to prevent a flood, but it does help you know what to do to avoid it. And I'm also not alone in calling for this. I'm not just some random attorney from an environmental group saying, hey, let's do disclosure and transparency. It's awesome. No, this is a letter from 4 past FEMA administrators calling for better disclosure. You have Brock Long, Craig Fugate, David Paulson, and James Lee Witt. And what they've said is, as you can see from the highlight on the bottom, which I'll pull up now, we support solutions that would reduce the risk borne by taxpayers and the government while creating more resilient communities. One of those simple, common sense solutions would be to require sellers to disclose flood risks to home buyers. And that's what I want you to leave, I want to leave with you today, is that this is a common sense solution, it's a simple solution, and it's something that can be achieved through reform to the National Flood Insurance Program. Thank you.